Hello, welcome to the Board with Paint HeroQuest painting tutorial series. In this episode, we'll focus on what you do with your miniatures before you even touch them with any paint. If you're an absolute beginner, this is the video to start with. If you're not, this will most likely be a review for you, so feel free to skip to episode 1. For those of you that are still here, let's get right into it. To get the best paint job possible, you'll want to do some prep work ahead of time. This is generally broken down into 3 areas: removing mold lines, filling gaps, and priming. First, we'll talk about removing mold lines. I have here the male barbarian miniature. And going around, you can see that there are some artifacts left over from the manufacturing process. There's this nub on the base. On the leg, you can see there's some mold lines where the 2 pieces of the mold went together. And there are other problems elsewhere on the model. Once we have paint on the miniature, these defects will become much more apparent. But by that time, it's too late. So you should make an effort ahead of time to remove them. There's another one here under the arm. Sometimes the mold lines will be in inconspicuous locations, so don't feel like you need to remove every single one. I tend to only remove the ones that are obvious or that are on an area that is supposed to be flat. I also sometimes avoid removing mold lines in highly textured areas where the removal could actually damage the model. Here's one on the base that's on an area that's supposed to be totally flat. To actually remove these defects, there's some tools you'll need to use. This is a Citadel mold removal tool. This works really well as it's specifically designed for this purpose. If you don't have that, however, you can just use an X-Acto knife like this. I sometimes go between these depending on the situation. Files can also be useful for smoothing down the mold lines. I also like to use these sanding sticks, which have a coarse side and a fine side. These I use a lot for removing mold lines. And finally, I like to use an old toothbrush to brush away any of the dust created from sanding or filing. I'm going to start off with the sanding stick, and I'm going to use the coarse side to sand down this nub that's on the base. The coarse side is good for moving a lot of material, and then you can use the fine side to do a final smoothing. You can use your finger to tell if you've smoothed it down enough. There's a less pronounced mold line on the other side of the base, so I'm going to hit that now. You may have the same miniature as this, but the mold lines and defects may not be in exactly the same place, so make sure you look around the entire model. Here I'm going to attempt to remove the mold line that's on top of the base in the rocks. I'm taking the X-Acto blade and I'm scraping the mold line, holding it perpendicular to the surface. You don't want to gouge out areas of the surface, you just want to remove the extra material. After removing a good bit of it with the knife, I'm now going in with the sanding stick. Here I'm smoothing an area I accidentally hit with the knife, and then I'm going in and smoothing out the area that we scraped. All of this scraping and sanding creates a lot of dust, so I'm taking the old toothbrush and trying to brush away all of that dust. If you leave the dust there, it'll get stuck to the model when we go to prime it, and it'll create unwanted texture. Now I'm going to use the mold removal tool on the mold line that is on the loincloth. This is used exactly the same way as the X-Acto knife, you just scrape the mold line away. And then of course we brush away all of our dust. I won't show all of the removal that I did, but you get the idea. Now let's talk about gap filling. Many miniatures are assembled from separate pieces. For many board games, this occurs at the factory, but other miniature games like Warhammer have you putting together your own miniatures. And anywhere where two parts meet has the potential to create a gap. Those gaps can be unsightly on a finished model, so before we paint, we try to fill those in. I'm going to be using Vallejo's plastic putty for this, but there are lots of products on the market that excel at this, most notably green stuff. I find the plastic putty a little bit easier to work with because you apply it very similarly to paint. Here I've put a little bit of the putty on a dry palette, and I'm now mixing it with a little bit of water to thin it down. This makes it flow a little bit, and it makes it easier to smooth out. When working with the plastic putty, use an old brush you don't care too much about. Now we just brush the mixture into the gap and let it flow in. Here I'm stabbing a little bit with the brush to force it into the gap. The putty can be very forgiving, so it's okay if you get it in areas that aren't actually the gap. Next, I'm using a damp brush to smooth it out a bit. This will prevent it from obscuring any other details on the model. You can use the brush to push it around and also soak up excess. Once our putty dries completely, we can then prime the miniature. The plastic that the miniatures are manufactured from does not stick to paint very well. That's why we want to prime miniatures before we paint them. There are a wide variety of primers available that you can use. I prefer to prime using my airbrush, that way I don't need to take it outside because of the fumes, but any rattle can primer would work. I'm going to be showing you a technique known as zenithal priming. This involves using 2 or more shades of primer to easily sketch out the areas of light and shadow. I'll be starting here by covering the entire model with black primer. I'll be priming all the hero figures here. It can be expedient to do many miniatures at once when using an airbrush or a spray. You want to make sure that you hit the model from every angle, so that nothing is left unprimed. I've stuck the miniature to a popsicle stick with some sticky tack to give me more mobility with it. Now for the zenithal part, we're going to go with some white primer and spray it only from above the miniature. This will leave portions of the miniature that are facing the ground still dark, and will provide us with a good sketch of where to put our highlights later. And it's that quick. Now the miniature's ready to paint. Thanks for watching Board with Paint, and be sure and check out the next episode in this series where I show you how to paint this barbarian. If you found this video helpful, please leave a like and consider subscribing to my channel. Follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and until next time, happy painting.